If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out. I don't have to say anymore, but that's what it is. And they should have given them back a long time. They should have never taken them. They should have never.
Carmel Gat, killed in captivity in Gaza, praising President-elect Trump.
I think Trump was the X factor in bringing this deal to life.
Today, we're diving into the recent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It's a situation
with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of moving parts and a heavy human cost, too, of course. Got some news articles that lay out the agreement, what led up to it, and all the major players involved. So by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand not just what this deal says, but also what made it so difficult to reach and what it might mean for the future.
It's a really fragile situation, and we need to be mindful of that very real human cost.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. What are the core elements of this ceasefire agreement?
Well, this deal includes a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. That was, a major sticking point in the talks. It also calls for the release of hostages held by Hamas, starting with the most vulnerable groups, like children and the elderly. Initially, we're talking about 33 hostages being released. The agreement also includes a provision for the release of 1,000 Palestinian prisoners currently held by Israel. This first phase is set to last 6 weeks.
6 weeks? That seems like a really short time frame, given, the sheer magnitude of this conflict, which has been going on for over a year now.
Yeah, it is a short time frame. And tragically, we know some hostages will be returned dead, which is just a stark reminder of the devastating impact this conflict has had. Over 46,000 people have been killed in Gaza alone, with almost 110,000 injured. It's just, difficult to even comprehend those numbers.
It's just, yeah. And the impact on civilians, especially women and children in Gaza, has been disproportionately high, which I think really underscores the urgency of finding some kind of resolution. It's just,
Yeah.
This ceasefire wasn't exactly a walk in the park to achieve, was it?
No, not at all. It was a long and difficult process with multiple attempts at ceasefires that ultimately failed. There was a lot of back and forth accusations of bad faith on both sides. You had high stakes involvement from leaders like President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Qatar and the United States were also heavily involved as mediators.
Wow. So what were some of the specific events that stalled progress along the way?
Well, one significant hurdle was the assassination of several key figures. That includes Hamas leaders like Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar was actually believed to be one of the masterminds behind the 2023 terror attack on Israel. You even had Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah assassinated. Israel claimed responsibility for these deaths, which obviously inflamed tensions.
Wow, yeah. I can only imagine. Those assassinations must have created a huge setback in the negotiations.
They did. And then there was the incident where Israel remotely detonated explosives that were hidden in Hezbollah equipment in Lebanon. These types of events, coupled with just the constant accusations of bad faith, really created a climate of deep mistrust, making it incredibly challenging to find any kind of common ground.
Right. It sounds like a really toxic environment for negotiations. And on top of all of that, you had Netanyahu dealing with intense political pressures at home.
Yeah, absolutely. Netanyahu faced opposition from all sorts of different groups. I guess you could classify some of them as far-right elements within Israeli politics. They tend to hold these hardline stances on the conflict, and they really advocate for a strong military response. They oppose concessions to Hamas, and their influence, within the government put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. It made it really difficult for him to maneuver in these negotiations.
Yeah. So you've got all this internal politics at play, on top of the complex dynamics of the conflict itself.
Yeah.
What about the role of the United States in all of this? It sounds like they were more than just passive observers.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Both the Biden and Trump administrations were very actively involved in pushing for a deal. It's interesting. You had this unusual level of cooperation between an outgoing and an incoming administration. They both recognized the urgent need to secure the release of those hostages.
Right, yeah. It's rare to see that kind of collaboration, especially on such a sensitive issue.
Yeah. And it really speaks to the gravity of the situation. And of course, you can't forget Trump's very public, very dramatic declaration that all hell would break out in the Middle East if a deal wasn't reached before he left office.
That sounds about right coming from Trump. But it seems like his pressure, combined with the efforts of both administrations and all the international mediators, might have actually been a driving force in reaching this agreement.
Yeah. It's certainly possible. The combined pressure from all sides probably created a sense of urgency that helped push the negotiations forward.
So we've laid out the key elements of the ceasefire, the incredibly difficult path to get there, and the key players involved. But the big question on everyone's mind is, will it hold? Will this be a stepping stone toward a lasting peace, or just another temporary pause in a seemingly endless cycle of violence?
Yeah, that is a million-dollar question, and one that we're going to need to explore further. That really is the question, isn't it? Like at the heart of all this. To understand the potential for lasting peace, we need to look back, I think. Look back at previous ceasefire attempts and why they fell apart. It helps to highlight just how complicated this whole situation is.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Like setting the stage for us.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of a previous attempt and what happened?
Yeah, sure. So back in November 2023, there was this ceasefire that offered, at least for a short time, a glimmer of hope. It actually resulted in the release of over 100 hostages that had been taken during the attacks back in October of that year. In exchange, Israel released 240 Palestinian prisoners and detainees.
It sounds like a pretty significant breakthrough, so why didn't it hold?
Well, it collapsed. And it collapsed pretty quickly. Each side blamed the other, as you might expect. Hamas claimed that Israel refused to extend the truce, while Israel, with the backing of the U.S., argued that Hamas actually broke the agreement first by firing rockets into this Israeli city, Sderot. So, the cycle of violence just resumed.
So despite the progress, that underlying tension and mistrust was still there. It sounds like the negotiations that followed didn't go so smoothly either.
Oh, they were incredibly tense. Hamas repeatedly accused Netanyahu of, intentionally sabotaging the talks. They were saying he was more interested in his own political survival than actually achieving peace, and they pointed to the ongoing killings of Hamas leaders as evidence of this.
That's a serious accusation. How did Netanyahu respond to that?
Well, he countered, of course, by arguing that the deaths of hostages held by Hamas, actually demonstrated their lack of interest in peace. Publicly, both he and most of his top officials maintained that their ultimate goal was actually just the eradication of Hamas completely. So, you have this clash of narratives. Each side is accusing the other of basically operating in bad faith, all while the violence is going on and the death toll is rising.
It's just this awful, heartbreaking cycle. And it sounds like even the U.S., despite being actively involved, was growing pretty frustrated with the lack of progress.
Oh, absolutely. Their frustration was evident, especially as the humanitarian situation in Gaza was deteriorating. And, I think a real telling moment came in September. This is shortly after Israel remotely detonated those explosives that were hidden in the Hezbollah equipment in Lebanon. Blinken actually publicly expressed his exasperation. He was saying that every time they seemed to be making headway, something would happen to derail the process. It was a clear sign that the U.S. was losing patience with the lack of tangible results.
So what was the turning point? How did they finally overcome all of these hurdles and reach this agreement?
Well, it seems like a key factor was the re-election of Donald Trump back in November. Both he and his incoming Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, were very vocal about their desire for a deal before Trump's inauguration in January.
I can only imagine the kinds of pronouncements Trump was making about the situation.
Oh, yeah. He didn't mince words. He even went so far as to threaten that all hell would break out in the Middle East if the remaining hostages weren't released by the time he took office.
Classic Trump. But it seems like that very blunt approach might have actually applied some necessary pressure.
It's definitely possible. Witkoff made several trips to the region to try to push for an agreement. And it's interesting, he actually collaborated with Biden's envoy, Brett McGurk, on this. They both seemed to recognize the urgency of the situation, and they were willing to put aside any political differences to try to achieve this shared goal.
Yeah.
Even Blinken, despite his, previous frustrations, expressed hope that they could actually finalize a deal within those remaining weeks of Biden's term.
It's remarkable. You have an outgoing and an incoming administration with such different approaches, different ideologies working together. And you've got the international mediators all pushing for this deal. It really speaks to, I think, just how serious the situation was.
Yeah, it really does. And as the negotiations intensified in early January, it became clear that both sides, both Israel and Hamas, were starting to see this potential path towards an agreement, even if it meant, making concessions that they previously resisted. We even had high-ranking officials like the head of Mossad, David Barnea, that's Israel's intelligence agency, by the way, who joined the talks in Doha.
The momentum was building. something.
Yeah.
But even with all this, I imagine there were still some, like, last-minute roadblocks and challenges to overcome.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Even in those final days, as Israeli and Hamas officials were signaling their willingness to compromise, there were still voices within Netanyahu's government that threatened to derail the whole thing.
Like, specifically which voices?
The strongest opposition came from, well, like we talked about before, those far-right elements within Netanyahu's own coalition. They were vehemently opposed to any kind of ceasefire. They said it amounted to, giving in to terrorism, and they even threatened to collapse the ruling coalition in protest.
So even with a potential deal in sight, Netanyahu's facing this internal pressure that could bring down his government. It must have been an incredibly difficult situation to navigate.
It was a high-stakes balancing act, and the fact that he managed to secure this agreement while also holding his coalition together, I think, is a testament to the immense political will and diplomatic effort involved. But, like we discussed earlier, the question of whether this fragile ceasefire can translate into lasting peace still hangs heavy. There are these deep-seated divisions, long-standing grievances that need to be addressed if there's to be any hope of a sustainable resolution.
It's been an incredibly insightful journey so far, unpacking the intricacies of this conflict and the tortured path to this ceasefire and the fragile hope that it represents.
And we've seen how external pressures, internal politics, and just the actions of these key individuals all played a role in shaping the events that led to this moment. But as you said, the story isn't over yet.
We've covered so much ground in our deep dive into the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. From the just devastating human cost of the conflict to the incredibly complex negotiations that got us to this point. But as we wrap things up, I'm wondering, what happens now? Is there any real hope that this very fragile agreement can lead to lasting peace?
It's the question everyone's asking, and it's tough to answer. Honestly, this ceasefire, while definitely significant, is just one step, It's one step on a long, potentially very challenging road. To even start, assessing its chances, we got to look at the obstacles in the way.
Right. Okay. So what are some of the biggest roadblocks?
Well, we've mentioned some already, like that deep animosity between the two sides fueled by, decades of conflict, decades of mistrust. Then you have the whole issue of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, a huge sticking point for the Palestinians. And then, of course, Hamas is still there. Hamas remains a strong political and military force in Gaza, adding another layer of complexity.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for disaster almost.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing the broader geopolitical situation doesn't exactly help matters either.
You're right. The Middle East is volatile, so many actors, so many competing interests. Any shift in the balance of power could have these, ripple effects impacting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This ceasefire, while important, it's just one piece of a much bigger, more complicated puzzle.
So with all that in mind, what are the chances this ceasefire actually holds and, maybe more importantly, paves the way for lasting peace?
It's really hard to say for sure. There's a ton of skepticism, which makes sense given the history of broken ceasefires in the region. But this time, what feels different to me is the level of exhaustion on both sides. After a year of just relentless fighting, devastating losses, it seems there's the shared recognition that the way things have been, it just can't go on.
Yeah, the human cost is unimaginable. It feels like everyone, even the most hardline folks, have hit a breaking point. Could that shared fatigue be a motivator for peace?
Absolutely. War fatigue is powerful. It's not just the loss of life. It's the economic ruin, the displacement, the trauma. It takes a toll, creates a yearning for something better.
So there's reason for caution, but also these glimmers of hope, that shared desire for a better future, a weariness of war, and that continued involvement from the international community.
Yeah, that's huge. The commitment from external actors, especially the U.S., has been key. Their continued engagement, the diplomacy, the aid, the economic support, it's all crucial to making sure the ceasefire holds and that both sides can actually start addressing those underlying issues.
It's not a quick fix, is it?
Yeah.
We're talking about this long, complex process that needs more than just political will.
Mm-hmm.
It needs a change in attitudes, a willingness to move beyond the pain and the past.
Exactly. No quick fixes, no easy answers. Lasting peace demands patience, compromise, a real commitment from everyone to build that shared future. It won't be easy, but the alternative, going back to the violence and the suffering, it's just, unthinkable.
We've come to the end of our deep dive into the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. You've broken down this incredibly complex situation so well. I've learned a lot. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. It's important to remember these aren't just abstract issues on a map, These are real people, real lives. The consequences of this conflict, they're huge.
And as always, we're trying to give you the knowledge and insights you need to navigate this complicated world. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of the situation in the Middle East and the challenges that are still to come.
Maybe even sparked some new questions for you, encouraged you to dig a little deeper on your own.
That's what we like to hear. Keep those minds engaged, keep exploring, and join us next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters.